Hiya. This is to make up for what we didn't manage to get to on Friday. So we were looking at hexagram number 33, sometimes called hiding, sometimes called strategic withdrawal. I prefer, sometimes called retreating. I prefer the term yielding, because the overarching theme is to do with trusting in a situation where it doesn't appear to be safe. So you will recall that there are 64 hexagrams, each describing one aspect of the human condition, and you'll recall that there are 6 lines to each, meaning there are 6 ways out, and in point of fact a much larger number than that, because you can change one line or no lines or anything between none and 6. So we're presented with this hexagram, and the text says simply a sacrificial offering, small profits for divination. And the image is of a piglet awaiting to be slaughtered. If you're a vegetarian, that's a particularly hideous image. If you're not, it may not be anything other than a cute little piglet. The piglet's probably not happy. So there is something definitely kind of dangerous, kind of vulnerable about the initial image. Now, each line opens to another hexagram, as you know. So the first line, the bottom line, if we change from retreat, which is of course heaven over mountain, if we change the first line, we get heaven over fire. And that hexagram is number 13, Tong Ren, which is sometimes called the union of men, and it implies cooperation. So we have this image of these 4 yang lines over 2 yin lines, and we are in this position where we have to enter a situation of withdrawal, of exposure, which is not necessarily supported or safe. So this first line, Tong Ren, is that the solution perhaps is cooperation. But heaven on fire implies that that cooperation is in opposition to something. And at this point in our evolution, it does look as if human beings need to have an enemy in order to cooperate. So it's a kind of a flawed option in this kind of crowd of retreating people, if you like. I have an image of maybe chariots in warfare retreating from an overwhelming enemy. But the cooperation aspect of it is not as simple as cooperating, it's cooperating against. And perhaps the metaphor right now you might consider is that we can cooperate perhaps in the teeth of COVID-19, and some people have called the current situation apocalypse light. It may be that we are rehearsing for cooperating in the teeth of climate change. And are we up to doing that? And perhaps we could evolve to a point where we could cooperate without an enemy, without an adversary, without a threat. So the first line here is we are being threatened from one direction and we are retreating in the other direction, and we're considering whether we are doing something that is wise, that is prudent, or whether we're doing something that is cowardly. So we come to the second line, and when we change the second line, of course we're simply going back to the hexagram we looked at last month. That would be the impact of changing that line. That's hexagram 44, coup. And that word coup describes it. The word in English, C-O-U-P, coup, is probably appropriate. It is about some kind of subversive action, some kind of betrayal. You'll remember that it was one of the aspects of it, one of the implications was of the queen being unfaithful to the king while far from the court. So hexagram 44 is a flawed kind of refuge. So we are still in the yin lines. It's all chaos. Everything is moving rapidly away. There's no safety. There is no support. But when we get into the third line, which is yang, there is support. But it means we're kind of bound up. It means that we are not actually able to move. So where the first line says a hidden tail, so you're the trailing edge, and the second line says to hold, use a yellow bull's hide, yellow being about the middle path. This third line says bound and hidden. So you can see this person retreating, being in a situation where this fluid chaos has now moved, and they're now tightly packed, as if, as I said on Friday, kettled, as if having to simply surf on this crowd, and they have no power. And we have no power at this point. We know that the light returns, and we would like to think that we are able to make it return, but actually what we are then is on this line 3, is aware that we are unable to control pretty much anything. There is hardly a thing that we are able to control. We are aware that we are spinning alone in darkness on an imaginary ball of mud. And at this point, we decide whether we will have faith, whether we will have trust. And it's not a question of whether we have faith in something like ourselves or leadership or an example or friends around us. It is simply faith, simply trust. And this process is happening on the level of the growth and decay of all things, as well as in our own lives. And this process is happening every year. We know that the light returns. Well, we think that it does. You know, perhaps at some point it doesn't. Can we be sure? And what's required is faith, because faith and trust are things that are expressed when we are not sure. So the next one that we would come to is hexagram number 12, here at the third change. And hexagram number 12 is called P. Sometimes its name is P. Sometimes referred to as stagnation. And it is heaven over earth, which you might think of as being a nice, cozy, metaphysical idea. But heaven above earth, heaven is going up, earth is going down. There is a separation. And the stagnation is perhaps contemporary. We are looking at disappearing into our heads, disappearing into perhaps computer games or whatever we are doing when we have to be at home and perhaps we want to be doing things elsewhere. You know, it's maybe disappearing into our heads, drinking red wine and eating chocolate. Nothing wrong with that for a while, but the time that follows, it has to be a time of regeneration. But at this point, the light is beginning to fade. Last month, we could say, well, it's still mostly light. Now, it's much more balanced. And when we come to this line, heaven over earth, the yin and the yang are balanced. And then when we change line 4, we come to hexagram 18, which is maybe the most difficult one here, Gu, which is poison. The underlying story is that the picture is of poisonous creatures put into a bowl and left to sting each other until there's just one left, and then that last one is liquidized and turned into a potion. It doesn't sound that appetizing, but the image is of seeing chaos going on, of seeing upset, of seeing misery, of seeing warfare, and not becoming involved. It is the image perhaps of responding to Black Lives Matter as White Lives Matter too, which of course is true, but rather less urgent. But at the point of Gu, we see it all and we hold ourselves back. We are not becoming involved. And then we come to the fifth line, which is the ruler of the hexagram. And the ruler of the hexagram is either the one that is the best, if you like, or the one that typifies the hexagram. And in this case, it's both. And of course, the fifth line is most likely to be the ruler, because it is the only line that can be yang, central, and correct. And it's in this case, it takes us to hexagram 56, which is Lu the Traveller, fire on the mountain. Fire on mountain. I sometimes remember that. That's Red. You've heard him before. He's been described as larger on the inside than he is on the outside. You wouldn't believe he's only about this big. Anyway, hexagram 56, sometimes called the beacon, and I always think of the towards the end of the Return of the King in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where Pippin has lit the beacon at Minas Tirith, and because that beacon has been lit, a beacon miles away is lit because someone sees it, and then 1 miles away again, and further and further. And at that point, we are in it all together because everyone knows what's going on. But more to the point, there is light and there is a direction. So where we have been in this situation where we don't know what power we have and what's going on, we can now see light. It's not the sun, but it is light and it is direction. We have a path to follow now. That is the power of the 5th line of this hexagram. And then finally we come to the 6th, which many consider to be a really helpful line, which takes us, if we change that line, to hexagram 31. And 31 is perhaps the most important hexagram there is. Firstly, it is the point where what's called the upper canon becomes the lower canon, so spiritual mumbo jumbo becomes practical stuff. It's the second half, if you like. And also, number 31, Hien, don't trust my pronunciation, is it is lake over mountain. And this is a very important thing. You remember we talked about how King Wen looked at the implications simply of the lines, what they looked like, and then looked at how they fitted into the structure of society that he saw. So the lake, youngest daughter, over mountain, youngest son, is an appropriate relationship. The youngest son should be associating with the youngest daughter. But also, the youngest daughter is, in the nicest possible way, on top. She has chosen him. So the heroic qualities, if you like, of the hero, the power of the youngest son, the aspiration, the strength, and of course the youngest son has a big spiritual agenda. This is mountain. The power is in the service, if you will, of the goddess, and this is about the overarching hexagram, perhaps of this year, number 42, which is about the rebalancing of the yin and the yang. And here in the top line, the sage, the mystic, the beyond the mundane, we have hexagram 31, where the yin and the yang are balanced again. There are 3 yin lines and 3 yang lines in that hexagram, but it's positioned so that it is the young man is wise enough to be gracious in being instructed. So we're now 3 hexagrams into the process from the light to the dark, and we are able to see perhaps that it's safe, and the way through at this point in history, this point in this year, this point in any year perhaps, is an awareness that light always follows dark. It may in time not be that the summer solstice follows the winter solstice in billions of years' time. That may not be the case. But light always follows dark, and dark always follows light, and the process can be trusted.